And God said, "Let there be light." And the director said, "Who f***ed with my settings?"
Today we're going to be talking about getting correct exposure. Not that kind of exposure. Exposure refers to how much light you capture in your image. And there are three main settings in your camera that affect this. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO. And we're going to go over each of them today, what they do, and how you should use them. Let's get into it. We're going to go through these in the order that you should realistically set them up for each shot. So first, we're going to look at shutter speed. Shutter speed is the easiest one to start with, because 9 times out of 10, it's going to be fixed for the entire time you're shooting. That's because of something called the 180-degree rule, which effectively means your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. More about frame rates up here. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, our shutter speed should be 1/50. If we're shooting at 30 frames per second, it's 1/60. If we're shooting at 60 frames per second, it's 1/120. Shutter speed refers to the amount of time light has to hit the back of your sensor, and is measured in fractions of a second. You can think of it like the time it takes for your camera to blink. The faster your shutter speed is, the less light you'll be able to get into the back of your sensor, because the shutters themselves will literally be open for a less time. This will result in a darker image, which is why when you shoot at higher frame rates, and therefore a faster shutter speed to compensate for that, because of the 180-degree rule, the darker your image will be. The other consequence of shutter speeds is motion blur. The higher your shutter speed is, the less motion blur you'll see. This is why we use the 180-degree rule in films, because we've decided it's the most cinematic. Next up is your aperture, or f-stop. This is controlled by blades at the back of your lens actually opening or closing, increasing or decreasing the amount of light allowed through the lens into the sensor. To keep it as simple as possible, the higher your f-stop value, the less light you're letting in. Why does the higher number mean less light? Because it's a fraction. So the higher number is actually on the bottom, so it's actually a smaller number in total. As well as controlling light, however, your f-stop affects depth of field, which can often make or break the cinematic look of your films. If you want the beautiful bokeh and that really blurry background, then you must shoot at a low f-stop to achieve it. This is why we consider f-stop to be more of an artistic choice than a practical one, and you really shouldn't be trying to fix your exposure with your f-stop. Get the shot that you want, and then light accordingly. So if our shutter speed is fixed due to our frame rate, and our f-stop is an artistic choice and not a practical one, how do I control the amount of light I'm getting in my image? Well, that we usually do with the ISO. What is ISO? Well, the best way to think about it is your camera digitally enhancing the brightness of the image. This does, however, cause some issues. You see, every camera has what's called a native ISO. And once you start going above that, you're going to start getting artifacting, and noise, and grain. And your image is going to look shitty. The native ISO for every camera is different, so, Google it. And some cameras can manage to use a higher ISO value than others without their image becoming too unusable. I, however, shoot on a GH5, which kind of sucks. ISO at least is a bit easier on the fact that a higher number means a brighter image. I feel like I've rushed through this a little bit, but I'm trying to condense a lot of information into easily digestible chunks. So again, start with your shutter speed. It should be either 180 degrees or 1/double your frame rate. Move to ISO, set it to whatever you artistically want to get your beautiful bokeh in the background. And then adjust your ISO accordingly to try and get the best lighting for your image without introducing too much grain. So what do you do, say, if your shutter speed's set correctly, your f-stop's as high as you're willing to go, and your shutter speed's as low as it can be, and your image is still too bright? Well, you can invest in something called an ND filter, which are essentially sunglasses for your camera. And these will effectively give you a higher f-stop without actually having to change the aperture in your lens, and therefore not affect the bokeh. What about the other end of the spectrum? What if your shutter speed's again set correctly, your f-stop as low as it'll go and still manage to get everything you want in focus, and your ISO is as high as it'll go without making your footage unusable? Well, turn a f***ing light on.